Welcome everybody to our daily class, our joint project between Jewish National Fund and Alexander Muss High School in Israel. Where each and every day we get together and learn with one of our amazing Muss educators. Today we're privileged to be learning with Benji Berman. Benji grew up in Sunderland in the northeast of England and was a dedicated member of B'nai Akiva. After graduating from school, he spent 2 years studying in yeshiva in Israel. He returned to England and completed a BA in archaeology and an MA in Jewish history. During this time, he served as National Director of B'nai Akiva, UK. Benji made Aliyah with his wife in 2005, and since then has been working as an educator on various programs, including Machon L'Madrichei Chutz La'aretz, Ramah Israel, and Young Judea Year Course. He's also an educator at Yad Vashem. Benji lives with his wife, Emma, and children. I'm going to say children because I'm not sure if this is how many children. 3 children. Noah, Adi, and Nadav in Modi'in. Anything else on that that is missing?
No, great.
And of course, Benji is one of our amazing Alexander Muss High School in Israel educators. And on a personal note, when I started as the National Director of Recruitment almost 3 years ago, my first return trip to Alexander Muss in many years, I had the privilege of spending a full day learning with Benji and his students, and it brought me back to my days as a Muss student. And I'm forever grateful, Benji, for that time on top of Har Herzl, learning with you and being together with you. So thank you for that. Thank you for being with us today, Benji. Thank you, everybody, for being on the call and the class. Benji, the classroom is yours.
Okay, so thanks so much, Greg. As I suppose everybody knows today, in Israel and around the world, we're marking Yom HaShoah. And the question that I want to really deal with is why specifically today? That's kind of like the question that I want to deal with over our time together. Because the truth of the matter is, especially here in Israel, when we are dealing with Yom HaShoah, there's a huge amount of attention in the media on Holocaust survivors, obviously, here in Israel. And one of the recurring things that you hear when listening to these survivors on the media is, you know something, it's not that we just need it's not one day a year is Yom HaShoah. For the survivors, often, every day is like their own Yom HaShoah. Every day in the calendar, there's a different date that was significant and important. It's not just that this day is the only day that they remember what happened to them. And this is something that I always, when I'm teaching the Shoah with my students at Alexander Muss, is I always try and remind them what actually happened today. Because every day could be Yom HaShoah day. Like, what happened today? Irrelevant of the fact that it's Yom HaShoah. So today's the English date is the 21st of April. And I wanted to do, before starting our class together, I wanted to have a little look. I wanted to research and say what actually happened today, 21st of April, during the time of the Shoah. And my research took me in the direction of a small Jewish community in Russia called ption, where it was really, really small Jewish community. It only had 283 Jews living there in 1939. Something that, I'd never heard of this community until I looked up the 21st of April. This Jewish community was occupied by the Nazis in July 17th, 1941. And listen how long this community survived for. We know that there were terrible mass murders throughout occupied Soviet Union by the Nazis already from that summer of 1941. They last all the way through until April the 21st, 1942. They last nearly a whole year, or the majority of a year after that, until on this very, very day, on April 21st, 1942, this wonderful small Jewish community was obliterated and mass murdered in the forest adjacent to their village. And the point I want to say is that happened today, 21st of April, relevant to the fact that it's Yom HaShoah today. And I want to ask the question, well, okay, so if any day could be Yom HaShoah day, because every day in the year something could have happened, why specifically today? In fact, the Israeli Knesset passed the law only on April 8th, 1959. It took until 1959 to put it into law that today's Hebrew date, the 27th of Nisan, would be considered Yom HaShoah V'Gvurah, the day in which Israeli society will remember the victims of the Shoah. And the question I really want to ask is, why did they choose this date? And the truth of the matter is that when they chose this date, it wasn't the only date that was put on the table. There was a whole array of different, there was actually a big argument about which date should be chosen. And what I'd like us to do in our time together is I'd like us to go through what were the different options that were put on the table and that were discussed. What happened on each of those specific dates and why those dates were significant. And then I would like to open it up to the floor. If all of us could be if we were the Knesset of 1959 and we had these 5 options available to us, which one would we have chosen to be the most important date for Israeli society in the Jewish world to remember the victims of the Shoah? So I've prepared a little presentation. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you guys. Can everybody see it? Just a thumbs up. Is that good? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Fantastic. So why today? Why the 27th of Nisan? So what were the different options? It didn't have to be the 27th of Nisan. And what were the different options? So I'm going to start with potentially the most obvious one, which is Tisha B'av, the 9th of Av, which was actually proposed by the leader of the opposition, Menachem Begin. There's a picture of him there on the slide. He was himself. It's really, really important to remember that he himself was the child of a mother and a father that were both murdered in the Holocaust. He was an orphaned by the Holocaust. His father was killed in that infamous murder of the men of the town of Brest. And he also lost a sibling. And Menachem Begin's choice, if there was going to be a national day for Israeli society to remember the Shoah, he said it should be Tisha B'av. And the reason for him was very, very, very clear. Tisha B'av marks the date, our traditional day of mourning that marks the exile of the Jewish people, the destruction of the first and subsequently the second temple. I've got the picture, the famous picture from the inside of Titus's arch that sits in Rome, the triumphal march, arch showing the vessels of the Bet HaMikdash of the temple being paraded into Rome, and for him, he said, you know what, the Shoah, the Holocaust, is the ultimate expression of what it means to be in galut, in exile. Exile for Menachem Begin meant persecution. And the only answer to that was therefore Israel. And therefore for him, he said it needs to be Tisha B'av. Incidentally, it's also connected to the Shoah because Tisha B'av was actually the date in which the beginning of the mass deportation of the Jews of Warsaw started in 1942. They chose the date of Tisha B'av, but I'm actually going to talk about that later on in terms of one of the other options because it's connected to that. So anyway, that's option number one. I think it's clear. Tisha B'av, the proposed by Begin, the national mourning day that's traditionally for Jews throughout the generations. Option number two, the second option was actually put forward by the German community living in Israel. They were nicknamed the Yekim, the German Jews living in Israel, put forward the date for their proposal on the table of the 9th to the 10th of November, the The reason being because that was the night of the 9th through to the 10th of November was the date of the infamous Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. What was Kristallnacht, and why was it the German Jews' option, and what they thought should be the case? Well, the story of Kristallnacht really is a story of migration. Come the year 1938, the middle of 1938, the official policy of the Nazi Germany towards the Jews of Germany is that they just wanted them all to leave. They wanted them to get out. But Jews that did not have the means to do so weren't leaving in mass numbers, or enough numbers for the Germans. So the Germans decided to take things into their own hands. And they deported 17,000 Jews living in Germany that were originally of Polish origin. And they sent them back into Poland. Poland didn't take them in. So they ended up in this, and there's a picture of it on the slide, of this terrible kind of like little town in no man's land called Spongin, in between Germany and Poland on the border. And they were just basically left there without any provisions. By the way, one of those deportees was actually my grandfather of blessed memory, Shulam Haspel, was one of those people that was deported. And another family that was deported was the Greenspan family. Now, the Greenspan family had a son by the name of Herschel. There's a picture of him on our slide, and he and they wrote a letter to him because he was studying in Paris at the time, and they wrote a letter to him describing the terrible things that had happened to them. And as a result of that letter, he got very, very, very angry, as an act of revenge, stormed into the German embassy in Paris and assassinated a German official there. And as a result of that, the Nazis carry out the first ever violent pogrom as a response to that, that was called Kristallnacht. Why was it called Kristallnacht? About 1,400 synagogues were destroyed and burnt down. Many businesses, Jewish businesses were destroyed, and the broken glass was the broken glass of their shop windows. For the first time ever under Nazi Germany, Jews were sent to concentration camps just because they were Jews. And in total in that night, 92 Jews were actually murdered on that first night. And it was this first ever real sense that the physical security of Jewish life was under threat. There was legislation against Jews, there was discrimination against Jews, but this was the first time that the physical well-being of the Jews was under threat. Just to kind of understand Kristallnacht even more about what happened and what it meant for the Jews of Germany, I wanted you to take a look at this picture of this Sefer Torah. This is a Sefer Torah that was from Leipzig in Germany. And what happened was this: on the morning of the 9th of November, 1938, an anonymous phone call was made to a man by the name of Chaim Israel, a member of the Jewish community in Leipzig, warning him, telling him, listen, there's going to be this violent pogrom, this violent act of against the synagogues. And Chaim Israel, as a result of that, took this Sefer Torah and hid it in a false wall in the University Library of Leipzig. By the way, he told his son, Chaim Israel did not survive the war. He told his son that he had hidden the Sefer Torah, but he didn't tell him where he had hidden the Sefer Torah. And it wasn't discovered until 1998, when they were in Leipzig, when they were doing refurbishments of this library, that they discovered this Sefer Torah. And I think it's a really wonderful, an important, poignant story in terms of understanding Kristallnacht, because it shows us how premeditated the whole thing was. The Nazis did it. The guy in the morning warns him because he knows what's going to happen in the evening. It was totally premeditated. The Nazis portrayed it as this natural outpouring of anger, but really it was top down. And the rationale behind it is they wanted to make life for the Jews in Germany so intolerable that no one would want to stay behind anymore, and all of them will want to leave. And it worked. No one wanted it after Kristallnacht. I remember talking to my grandmother about this. After Kristallnacht, no one wanted to stay in Germany anymore. If they had this false a sense of security before 38, that was shattered after Kristallnacht. And it's for that reason that the German Jews that did manage to get to Israel, felt that this moment of Kristallnacht, the first violent act, if you like, of the Nazis on a large scale, this should be the date to commemorate the Shoah. So far we've had two. We've had Tisha B'av, Menachem Begin, the German Jews put forward Kristallnacht. The third option was actually put forward by the chief rabbinate in Israel, which was the 10th of Tevet. The story behind why the 10th of Tevet, which is a traditional fast day in our Jewish calendar, the reason it goes, there's a story. There's a backstory to why Asara B'Tevet was given the nod of the chief rabbis of the country. Asara B'Tevet, a traditional a date in the Jewish calendar, a fast day, actually mentioned already in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, mentions that the Asara B'Tevet was the day in which the Babylonians started the siege of Jerusalem, and traditionally a fast day. So what's this connection to the Shoah? It all goes back to 1942. As I mentioned before, in Tisha B'av of 1942, it was the beginning of the big, massive deportation of the Jews of Warsaw. Come the summer of 1942, after the terrible years of the ghetto, there was around about 400,000 Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto. Already 80,000 had already been indirectly murdered as a result of the conditions inside the ghetto. And the big, massive deportation starts on Tisha B'av 1942 until Yom Kippur 1942. 330,000 Jews were taken out of Warsaw. They were taken to, if you look at the picture to the left of the screen, to a place inside the ghetto, a depot point next to the train line. It was called the Umschlagplatz. They had to wait there under terrible scorching conditions for many, many hours, and taken by train to one of those, the infamous Operation Reinhard death camps at Treblinka. And as I said, 330,000 Jews were deported in about 2 months, from Tisha B'av to Yom Kippur. That's how long it took to virtually destroy the second largest Jewish city in the world at the time. By the way, just a footnote to this, if you go, those that have been to Poland, that have been to Treblinka today, you'll notice the fact that there's nothing left of the original camp. The Nazis dismantled the camp in the summer of 1943. And the reason why they did that is because it basically had done its job. The role of Treblinka was to make specifically Warsaw and the northeast of Poland Judenfrei, free of Jews, and it had done its job. And the news of this terrible deportation and murder in Treblinka filtered its way quite quickly back into the ghetto. And from there, news of the mass murder of Jews then started to, through different channels, got out of the ghetto and was passed around the world in the early autumn of 1942. And obviously with the world becoming aware of basically what had happened to the second largest Jewish city in the world, that news arrives in Eretz Israel to the issue of the Jewish community living here at the time. And as a result of that, the chief rabbis in Tel Aviv decided that the next available fast day of that year actually landed at the end of December 1942. At the end of that year, they decided that that fast day should be designated as a day of mourning and fasting. It's one of the minor fasts. Not everybody fasts on that day. They said that everybody should fast and make it a proper day of mourning and fasting over the Shoah that was taking place in Europe in that very, very, very year. This is a poster advertising that the commemoration of Asara B'Tevet as being a day of Yom Zikaron Shnati, the annual day of remembrance, of mourning, fasting, and eulogy of the Holocaust. I couldn't find an original one from 1942, but subsequently after that, because what happened is that the whole year went by to the next Asara B'Tevet, the following year, and the Shoah is still going on. The war's still going on. And so the chief rabbinate turned around and said, let's have another day of mourning and fasting. And then 1944 came around, the end of 1944, and the Shoah is still going on, the war still happening in Europe. And they say, we need to have another day of mourning and fasting. And then what happened? The war ended in 1945, as we know. And what happened was there were hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of survivors and relatives of loved ones who had lost their lives during the Shoah. And they turned around to the chief rabbinate and said, when shall we say Kaddish? When shall we say the mourners Kaddish for our loved ones who have perished in the Shoah? And the rabbinate said, well, we've already got this day anyway. For the past few years, we've been using Asara B'Tevet as this day of Kaddish. So let's continue. This will be the day of Yom Kaddish Klali. This will be the day. If somebody doesn't know the date upon which their loved ones were murdered, they should say Kaddish on this day. A general day of saying Kaddish. I remember I grew up in a town, Greg mentioned it before, in Sunderland, and I remember every year our rabbi of our community, Rabbi Tzahn of blessed memory, would, Asara B'Tevet, he lost his family in the Shoah, Asara B'Tevet, he would say Kaddish because he didn't know the date upon which his family was murdered. So that was option number 3. Asara B'Tevet, and it's and that's why that day is the Yom Kaddish Klali, and that was the proposal that was put forward by the religious establishments of the country. What about option number 4? The fourth option that was put on the table, which is actually designated today as the International Holocaust Memorial Day, is the 27th of January. The liberation of, which marks the liberation of Auschwitz. There were approximately 1.2 million people were deported to Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them, so 1.2 million people were deported to Auschwitz. 1.1 million people were brutally murdered there. About 1 million of them were Jews. It was by far the biggest and most infamous of all of the camps that we know. And just to put that number into scale, out of the 1.2 million people that were brought there when the Soviet Red Army liberates Auschwitz, and we remember that Auschwitz wasn't just one camp. It wasn't just Auschwitz and Birkenau and Buna. Those were the 3 main camps. It had a whole series of satellites of camps all around the area. In total, just think about this, out of the 1.2 million people that were brought there, the Soviets found in all of those camps around 7,650 survivors. To get another head around what happened on that day of the 27th of January, the Nazis, just before the Soviet army came there, burnt down 29 storehouses, but didn't get to burn down 6 of them. And the 6 remaining storehouses, just so we understand, that the Soviets discovered on liberation, contained 836,255 women's dresses, 348,000 sets of men's suits, and 38,000 pairs of shoes. That's what they discovered. And that was 6 out of the 35 of storehouses that was there, just to give us a bit of a glimpse of what that means for what Auschwitz was and what it represents. Just in terms of those numbers, it's hard to get our heads around that. And there were many that proposed that the date of the liberation of Auschwitz should be the day that basically that hell came to end, should be the day that we commemorate and remember the Shoah. I also want to point out, when we're thinking about the liberation of Auschwitz, I want you to take a look at this photograph, very, very famous photograph of the children who were liberated from Birkenau, and that it includes. I want you to take a look. Can you see? I'll use my arrow, my cursor. Can you see the young lady, young woman, young girl here with the blonde hair? This is a lady by the name of Martha Weiss. I mentioned Martha because in recent years, many of our alumni who have visited Yad Vashem have heard her testimony. And she was a young girl that was brought up in Bratislava and in Slovakia, and to quite an affluent family. And her parents actually sent her away to Hungary in order to be hidden with relatives. It's a very, very, very complex story about what happened to her. But the irony is they sent her to Hungary together with her sister Eva in order to survive. And then what happens in this time of the year, where it's like March, April of 1944, right? Towards the end of the war, we had the mass deportation of the Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and amazingly, she managed to survive together with her sister. When this photograph was taken, she was 10.5 years old. Together with Eva, who was slightly older with her. The reason why Marta, who was relatively well at the time, was not taken out of the camp, was because her elder sister Eva was very, very, very sick. Was very, very sick, and she decided to stay with her, despite the fact that she was very, very sick, and that's why they were saved. Saved and liberated at the end of the war. So that's option number 4, liberation of Auschwitz. What about and when I think about liberation of Auschwitz, I always think about Marta and that photograph and the amazing testimony that she gives at Yad Vashem to our students. By the way, the option of this date was something that was very much put forward by the extreme left-leaning voices within Israeli society in the 1950s. In the 1950s, it wasn't clear which way Israel would go in terms of support, on which side of the Cold War we were going to land. Were we going to be on the which side of the Atlantic. Are we going to be on the American side or the Soviet side? And there was even a communist party within Israel, and there was big, strong voices that wanted 27th of January to be the liberation of Auschwitz, to be the day that the Israeli society would remember the Shoah. Predominantly, those voices were coming from those voices that wanted closer connections to the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviet army liberating Auschwitz and that kind of like joint camaraderie with the Soviets was part of where that voice came from. But there was another option, and the other option was that of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto, which is option number 5, which the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is actually a very, very complicated date to choose, because it actually lasts for just under a month, between the 19th of April to the 16th of May, 1943. The difficulty of choosing a date, though, a specific date, because the beginning of the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising actually started on Seder night, on the first day of Pesach, on that night. And so what are we going to do? A Memorial Day on a Yontef, on a Chag, on Pesach in Israel. So it's a complicated date, but let's just go do a little bit of the background of the history to understand why was there the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising takes place towards the end of April, Pesach, 1943. As we spoke about before, in the summer of 1942, out of the 400,000 residents of Jewish residents of Warsaw, 330,000 of them were brutally murdered in the death camp of Treblinka, and that leaves 70,000 residents. Around about 70,000 residents. At its height, there were about 490,000 Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto. Tiny fraction of what was. And who was kept alive? Who did the Germans keep alive? Well, the Germans have always had this dilemma about what to do with the Jews. Should the Jews be murdered, or should the Jews be used for slave labor? And the answer obviously was, we're going to use them. We're going to do both. Those that could be used for slave labor would be used for slave labor, and those that couldn't would be murdered as part of the final solution. And therefore, the majority of the 70,000 Jews living in Warsaw come the end of 1942 were basically young adults that had already lost their families. Factor number 1. Factor number 2 is that, as we've also mentioned before, reports of what was happening in Treblinka filtered back into the ghetto. And therefore, there wasn't a Jew alive in Warsaw that didn't know what their fate was. Everybody knew what their fate was going to be. And therefore, for the first time, there's popular support for armed resistance against the Nazis. Basically, when you've got these two things, number 1, young people without families to look after anymore. Number 2, they know what the fate is going to be anyway. That, which is death. When you have those two factors together, the result is uprising. The first armed resistance actually starts in January of 1943. The Nazis tried to do their first attempt to deport Jews from Warsaw again, and they're met with armed resistance, and they pull back. And then the next concerted effort starts in Pesach, that year of 1943, led by you can see the picture of Mordechai Anilevich. And the idea really, I don't think anybody thought that anyone that was involved in the battle believed that there was anything was going to come from the uprising. In the words of Antek Zuckerman, it was just to leave an echo. One of the leaders, Antek Zuckerman, said it was to leave an echo. What does that mean? It means that the decision to fight wasn't the decision to live. It was a decision about how to die. And if we are going to die, we're going to die on our terms, not on the terms of the German Nazis. That being said, it's the first ever civilian urban uprising in all of Nazi Europe. Look how long it takes for the Germans to actually crush the rebellion. We've got these famous pictures that was taken of an album of album that was taken by the Germans to commemorate the destruction of the Jewish community of Warsaw. For me, the most poignant of all of the pictures taken in that infamous album is this one that we have over here. I find this picture so powerful for two reasons. Number one, if you look at the gentleman to the left, I wish I knew his name. If you look very, very carefully, for me as a religious Jew, I very much connect to him because I can see clearly his tzitzit, still wearing his tzitzit after all that time of battle. I find that something very, very powerful. And I also find the image of the woman to the right of the photograph. They're clearly being told to raise their arms, and this woman is kind of like holding her arms down in defiance. I find it an extremely, extremely powerful image. And it's this kind of image of this powerful resistance that was so important to Israeli society. To connect to it, I want to talk about what happened 5 years later. 5 years later, on the 19th of April, 1948, the State of Israel hadn't been even established. A ceremony took place to mark the 5 years after the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is a most fantastic photograph of the ceremony that marked 5 years since the outbreak of the uprising. You'll know all the different types of rabbis that there were, including the Polish chaplain of the army, and you've got American soldiers as well there. Various other uniforms, all saying prayers in memory of the outbreak. And if you look behind at the back of the screen, what was being done at that ceremony, it was the unveiling of a very, very, very important memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that was about to be revealed. Apparently, the rabbis refused to do their prayers of the ceremony in front of the graven images. We have obviously a law in Jewish law that says you're not allowed to pray in front of graven images. So they covered it with a sheet. They did the prayers. They put the Sifrei Torah. You can see the Aron of the Ark of the Sifrei Torah, that they put the Sifrei Torah back. And then they revealed this amazing memorial. And the memorial was created by this man. That's a picture of him and his wife, a man by the name of Natan Rappaport. He was a child of Warsaw, born in Warsaw, studied art in Warsaw, and like many kind of like the elites of Jewish society, with the invasion of the Germans in 1939, he ran away to the Soviet Union, and ended up spending the war in the Soviet Union, actually working for the Red Army, creating artistic propaganda works for the Soviet Army, and then comes back to Warsaw after the war. Remember Warsaw, this massive hub of Jewish life, basically destroyed at the end of World War II, both in terms of obviously the community, the people, but also the physical place. About 90% of the town of Warsaw, the city of Warsaw, was razed to the ground in the various battles, especially the area of the ghetto where the Jews were living. And he decided that it was really, he was the guy that pushed this agenda to put up this this memorial. This is a photograph taken of the memorial from afar, a little while after it was revealed, after that year of 1948. And you can note, for those that have been to Warsaw before, you'll note that it's surrounded by a city today. Look at all of that open space. That shows how much of a wreck the city was, and especially that area where the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was. And he pushed the agenda to have this statue. And what's interesting, this memorial made out of bronze. And what's interesting about it is it had two sides. You can see the people in the foreground with the steps approaching the main front of the statue, and at the back there was another one. I want to take a little bit of a closer look at what was being said by Rappaport and what he wanted to say about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. If we take a closer look, so this is a contemporary photograph of front and of the memorial done by Rappaport, and it's meant to represent an artistic picture of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters. Take a look at the middle, the character in the middle with the torso, so being shown with the strong arms, is meant to represent Mordechai Anilevich himself. Some people say actually it's more of a liking to Natan Rappaport, but that's another one. That's for another time. But anyway, if you take a look at this image, look how bold and strong and powerful these fighters were. Even though they're standing on top of the dead bodies of those that are already dead, they're 3D, full of life, looking out into the future, looking out with strength and power. Look at the way in which that young man is holding that dagger with such an image of those that could fight, and those, as opposed to what was on the back. Take a look now. I'll share with you a picture of what's on the back of the memorial, which is meant to represent the Jews being sent to their deaths, to the death camps. Look how forlorn they look how downtrodden they look how hopeless they are. They're all looking down, apart from one that's ironic, that's looking up to the heavens, holding a Sefer Torah. He's the only one that's looking up. But what does that, what is Rappaport saying about, is he celebrating that belief despite them being taken away, or is he showing the irony of what good is that going to do to you, holding on to your Torah? There's also a picture, if you take a look at the front, of a pregnant lady representing, those that try to continue. But certainly this is at the back. This is at the back of the memorial. And Rappaport's saying something, if I go back to this one, is saying something very, very, very clear about how do we remember? What is our memory going to be a focus of our memory? Who do we remember? And the idea is to remember that those heroes that fought back, they're going to be at the front. They're going to be the focus of our memory, because those were the heroes. Those were the people that didn't go, like Abba Kovner said, like lambs to the slaughter. Excuse me. Those were the people that took life into their own hands. And this story and this image really, really resonated within Israeli society. Those were the Holocaust, those that fought back in the resistance. Those were the Jews that we could be proud of, said Israeli society. Those were the people that took their fate into their own hands. They used to say, how could you recognize an Auschwitz survivor in Israel in the summer, in Israeli society, in Israel? And the answer is not the tattoo. The answer is long sleeves. It was an embarrassment to be a Holocaust survivor. It was, the accusation was, by many, and I don't think it was, evil or cruel. I think it was just based on ignorance. The accusation to these strange Holocaust survivors that came to Israel after the war was, why did you let this happen to you? Why did you go like lambs to the slaughter? Why, we in Israel, we fought this terrible war in 1948. You guys, you just let it happen to you. And I don't think it was meant to be cruel. I think it was just a lack of, at the time in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was kind of like a lack of understanding about what people actually went through, and understood what, they knew the numbers, they knew the names of the camps, they knew that there was gas chambers, but they didn't really understand the process of the persecution of the Jews of Europe. And it's for that reason, certainly, that Ben-Gurion put forward the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to be the date connected to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to be the date that we will remember. And in fact, it's not just called Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, it's Yom HaShoah v'Gvura. It's Holocaust and Heroes, or Heroes Remembrance Day. And he wanted to focus on that. And it's for that reason he chose Kaf Zayin Nisan, the 27th of Nisan, not because something specifically happened on that date. It's just because it was during the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Obviously, it couldn't be on the first day of the uprising because that was Pesach. It fit very, very well because in our calendar next week, we're going to be moving on to Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, our Memorial Day for fallen soldiers, and our Independence Day, and therefore this was the narrative, right? We go from this Shoah, from the Holocaust, to the Geula, to the redemption, which is the birth of the State of Israel, and these national holidays would fit on that nicely onto each other. However, for many, I think it was for many Holocaust survivors to say, you chose that date. You know how many people participated in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? There was about 70,000 Jews in the ghetto. Only about 1,000 to 2,000 maybe actual fighters. Just because of them, that's going to focus our memory. And I think it was very, very hurtful for many Holocaust survivors that specifically this date was put forward. Why specifically there? Well, because again, it's putting over that idea of who are we proud of to remember, who are we embarrassed a little bit to remember. And therefore, in the Knesset, they came up with a debate of 5 options. Tisha B'av, Kristallnacht, 9th of November, Asara B'Tevet, Yom Kaddish Klali, the day of Kaddish, liberation of Auschwitz, and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, with the 5 options. And if I'm gonna do stop share, and if
there you go.
Here we go. Stop share. In the minutes remaining, I just want to see. Let's pretend that we are the Knesset of 1959, I think it was, where they debated the date. Let's see if anybody would say, if you were in the Knesset and you were given those 5 options, which one would you choose and why? Why do you think that's the best date?
So I've judiciously given us all the ability to unmute yourself. The
Okay.
meeting is locked, so nobody can join. And we have a few minutes to, answer Benji's question and also ask any questions to Benji. So Benji, go ahead and ask the question again.
Yeah,
And then I'm going to ask if folks want to do it, they can just unmute themselves judiciously.
absolutely, absolutely. Which one? We obviously know what the Knesset obviously chose, which is today's date. But if you've got any feedback, what you think, what if you were there, what would you have chosen? Go for it.
Folks can unmute themselves. If you can't, you should be able to. But if not, you can send us a chatter or send us a chat.
Send us a chat or
allow participants. You should now be able to unmute yourself. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Try now.
Okay. Anybody? Should we do a vote? Should we do a vote? Which one would you go for? Anyone would have gone for the first option, Tisha B'av. Agree with Menachem Begin. Asara B'Tevet. What was the right choice? Was it the right choice? Okay. Okay.
Benji, I'm being asked to run through the different options again.
Oh, so you know what? I'll do the different options. 5 different options. Okay. Option number 1, Tisha B'Av. Okay. You know what? Should I share screen again and do this last? I think option number 1 was Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the traditional date. Number 2 was Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, the first violent pogrom. Number 3 was Asara B'Tevet, that became the day that people said Kaddish when they didn't know when their loved ones were murdered. 27th of January, liberation in Auschwitz. Number 5 was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Yeah, so those were the 5. If you were in the Knesset, which one would you have gone for?
So I'm torn between the liberation of Auschwitz and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because I like how the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising signifies standing up to fight against the oppression. So that's I'm a little bit torn between those two.
Why did you feel that the liberation? What was pulling you towards the liberation of Auschwitz?
I would say it signifies it really kind of is a significant date, signifying the end of the Holocaust and also liberation and celebrating liberation. And we Jews celebrate liberation during Passover, and that's a great date to celebrate a modern experience of Jewish liberation as well.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Yeah, very interesting. Anyone else? Don't be shy.
So, hi. I was thinking about the whole Tisha B'Av, and it seems to fall in really, there's a couple things about Tisha B'Av. One is it's in the middle of the summer, and I think that it does not get its real due because it's in the middle of the summer and it tends to be vacation and away from schools and everything like that. And also putting it in with all the other tragedies, at least for our generation, I feel it kind of minimizes the impact and the importance of what happens, and that it shouldn't be put together with those. Maybe in 200 years, I don't know, but for our modern day or postmodern society, I think that it can be part of that.
Absolutely. In terms of many historians really talk about the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And how and why is the Shoah something that there's tragedy, and there was terrible tragedy, but there was something about the Shoah that was different. The question is, if we're going to still be thinking about that difference in 100, 200, 300 years' time. Anyway, interesting. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Rick, you wanted to say something?
We are just we're just about out of time. I think it's
Okay.
such an interesting question, one in which I remember discussing, back at AMHSI so many years ago, but one that seems very relevant today. And I think for those who were able to join our previous class about the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann trials and the impact it had on allowing giving survivors the opportunity to share their stories openly and publicly post Eichmann trial without shame, without embarrassment, really coming out of the shadows. I think yesterday's class and today's class really fit really beautifully and nicely together as we stand together as a Jewish people commemorating Yom HaShoah. So, I want to say thank you, Benji, for the presentation, for running us through really just wonderfully presenting this and giving us a chance to commemorate Yom HaShoah in this way and learn together.
Thank you, Greg. And I just want to say something that I often discuss with my students is this question of memory and this question of the fact that if we want memory to stay alive and well and vivid, we have to make conscious efforts to think about how we remember and what we remember. And because memory is ideological, we remember our past in order to forge our future. And this question of choosing memory and thinking about memory shouldn't be something that we just accept. I think it needs to be something that we actively need to think about all the time. So thank you, Greg, again, for giving us the opportunity to discuss this.
And thank you, Benji. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Be well.